Good morning, all. Welcome to OPD's 30th Annual Spring Planning and Zoning Conference. This is the Historic Preservation and Housing Track. If you didn't see already, please check out our Planning and Zoning Training webpage that I'm going to put a link to in the chat right now, where you can find information, a link to our conference page where we will be posting recordings of each session of today's conference, a link to our planned webinar series, Planning Lunches at Noon, and past planned webinars, as well as a short survey to gather feedback on webinars and conferences. My name is Noah Hodgetts, and I will be your moderator for today's session. I'm a principal planner at OPD. Today's conference has 3 different tracks. As I mentioned already, you are in the historic preservation and housing track. There's also a planning board track and a zoning board track. You should have received an email yesterday afternoon that details out and provides you the meeting links for the other 2 tracks. Feel free to switch between tracks and sessions throughout the day. Don't feel wedded to stay with historic preservation housing track for the duration of the conference, just because that's the track you registered for. Just some quick information here. Again, all these sessions will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, hopefully sometime next week, if not the week after. Again, we'll send out an email to all registrants letting you know that the session recordings have been all uploaded to YouTube and are ready for viewing. And I'm going to put a link to the OPD YouTube channel in the chat right now. So, unlike our in-person conferences, which we last did in 2019, pre-COVID, so 5+ years ago at this point, which were capped at 400. This year we have over 500 people registered for today's conference, representing 166 towns and cities across the state. And you can see that on this map on the left side of the slide. The darker green communities have the highest number of registrants for today's conference. As I mentioned earlier, I'm with the Office of Planning and Development, and this conference is brought to you by the staff at the Office of Planning and Development at the New Hampshire Department of Business and Economic Affairs. Our office is comprised of 4 main programs: the Municipal and Regional Assistance Program, the Floodplain Management Program, the State Data Center, our partnership with the U.S. Census Bureau, and our Geographic Information Systems GIS program. The main services that we offer, shown on the right of your screen, include training, technical assistance, data, maps, resources, and coordination. For information about any of our services or general inquiries, please email planning@livefree.nh.gov. And as many of you are aware, in December 2020, seems like a very long time ago now, we launched our Planning Lunches at Noon planned monthly webinar series, which are held on the 3rd Thursday of each month from noon to 1 p.m. This slide you're seeing has a list of the webinars we have done to date this year. We don't have any upcoming planned webinars scheduled yet, but stay tuned for that information. And the slides and recordings of those webinars are also available on our Planning and Zoning Training webpage, which I did put the link to in the chat earlier. You can also find on the Planning and Zoning Training webpage links to our Planning Board and Zoning Board of Adjustment handbooks for Planning Board and Zoning Board of Adjustment members. They're great handbooks for both new members as well as long seasoned members. The training page also includes our optional Planning Board and Zoning Board handbook tests, which accompany the handbooks and test your knowledge on the handbooks, as well as a number of other publications and best practices by subject area. Again, that is available on our planning and zoning training page, which I will put a link to one more time in the chat right now. Another great housing related resource, since this is, after all, the historic preservation and housing track, is the New Hampshire Housing Toolbox, a collaboration of BEA and our office, the Office of Planning and Development, and the 9 regional planning commissions. The toolbox contains 20 planning and zoning strategies and tools for housing production in New Hampshire communities. It can be accessed at nhhousingtoolbox.org. And one upcoming training I wanted to bring everybody's attention to is that on Wednesday, May 22nd, so about a week and a half from now, New Hampshire Housing and the New Hampshire Planners Association are co-sponsoring an event titled The Dollars and Cents of Multifamily Development. It's geared towards professional planners, citizen planners, and local land use board members in New Hampshire in search of a deeper understanding of the housing development process, how multifamily housing development is financed, and the impact local regulations have on the cost of development. The training is all day. It's only $25, and it will include lunch. And the training will be held at New Hampshire Housing's offices in Bedford. You can register at the link on the screen, and I'm going to put that again in the chat as well. And as well for anybody, again, you should have received an email yesterday around 4 p.m., which included the updated link to our conference webpage, where you can download all the slides for each of today's conference tracks, and those should include live hyperlinks for all these slides, for all the links that I'm referring to. So I'm going to go ahead, let me see if I have that, and put that link right now. Just bear with me 1 second. Okay. All right, now we'll get into the just a little bit of prep of how for you all to participate in today's conference. For anybody that has not used Microsoft Teams meeting or webinar today, the meeting controls are located on the ribbon at the top of your screen as depicted on this slide. There are icons to raise your hand, to open the chat box, to react, and to change the screen view according to your preference. If you have a question during the webinar, please put it in the chat box, and we'll try to answer them as we go through each session. Some speakers have indicated a preference to hold questions until the end. And the camera and mic buttons are not operable during the webinar, but we will allow people on the phone to unmute themselves when we get, very weird. Excuse me all. Just getting a very weird format here. Hopefully you are not seeing our first presenter, Andrew Cushing, and I in together mode. If you are, my apologies, not quite sure what's going on there. But like I was saying, you should be able to all put your questions in the chat box. Your camera and mic buttons are not operable during the webinar, but we will allow people on the phone to unmute themselves when we get to the Q&A portion of each session. And then here's the agenda for today's Historic Preservation and Housing track. We're going to kick things off this morning with Preservation 101, the basics of preservation commissions. We'll then have a 15-minute break at 10:15, and then a session about infill development and design guidelines at 10:30. Then we'll have an hour lunch break from 11:45 to 12:45. We'll reconvene at 12:45 for a session titled Lessons Learned from the Housing Opportunity Planning Grant HOP grant program. And finally, our last session at 2:15 of the day will be a session titled What's Old is New Again, Affordable Home Ownership and Community. And we're about 5 minutes. We'll start our first session, Preservation 101. So please just hang out for a couple minutes, go grab that last cup of coffee, and we'll start the first session at the top of the hour at 9 a.m. And thank you so much for being here today. Okay, the time being 9 a.m., I'm going to turn it over to Brandy Laughlin and Andrew Cushing for our first session today, Preservation 101, the basics of preservation commissions. Andrew, we cannot hear you. I think you're on mute.
How's this work?
Perfect.
Okay. There was something funny with my link, and it wasn't allowing me in the meeting. I thought, oh no. All right. Good morning, everybody. Brandy and I are going to do some intros, and we're going to share this 101 presentation. Brandy, do you want to start since you're on top with who the Division of Historic Resources is?
There you go.
Still
Okay.
on me. Perfect.
Hi, so my name is Brandy Laughlin. I am the Preservation Planning and Development Coordinator at the New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources. The DHR is the State Historic Preservation Office. Every state and territory in the country has one, which I think we'll go over that on another slide. But we are New Hampshire State Historic Preservation Office. We act as a liaison to the National Park Service for programs like the National Register of Historic Places, which I think some of you might be familiar with, the Federal Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program, and the Certified Local Government Program. We also provide consultation for federal undertakings under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and a few other things. We wear a few hats. So that's who we are.
Great, and we're the friends of DHR. The Preservation Alliance is the statewide nonprofit for historic preservation. So we're kind of more advocacy based. We can buy alcohol for parties. DHR can't. And my job is the community services kind of manager or field service person. So I travel the state and I help mostly community projects, but also some planning assistance too with heritage commissions and historic district commissions as needed. We operate our 7 to Save program, which highlights the most endangered properties in New Hampshire every year. We celebrate successful projects through our achievement awards, which just happened this past week. And we also host and plan kind of educational programs, whether it's barn tours or our biennial conference. So we kind of are a grab bag of anything preservation related. Let's see if does this work? Am I we're getting out the kinks here. Okay. Does that work? Okay. All right.
Yeah, you're good.
All right, good. All right, so I think we're all involved in preservation for different reasons. And I think it's good to remind ourselves why we're sitting at these meetings and trying to encourage neighbors and towns to do the right thing, or in our mind, what the right thing is. So I always think that preservation is a really nice way to connect us to our past, kind of through a very physical, tangible landscape. I think if you compare, desirability of a community and you look at, the sprawl of maybe big box stores versus the historic villages and downtowns, there's a very clear connection to place in one and a kind of distorted view of the other, being the big box sprawl. There's also a lot of evidence that shows that historic preservation is inherently sustainable. Kind of the greenest building is the one already standing idea. I'm sure you've heard of that. But just the quality and the durability of the materials from 200 years ago, from 100 years ago, is far superior to what we can build now. There's economic studies, and the next slide will show some of those. So you can't build new and rent cheap. As one of my former colleagues said repeatedly, a lot of startups and whatnots and businesses will start in historic buildings because kind of the overhead costs have already been accounted for over 100 years. So there's some good economic studies out there that show preservation is good. And then I think probably the most familiar is just beauty and character. These places tend to have really good proportions. We're very familiar with the design, so there's a comfort that we see with these buildings, and I think it's good to be reminded of those bigger reasons why we save stuff when we're kind of stuck in the trenches, maybe dealing with politics at the local level. So these are some of those publications. If you are curious or you need some sound ammunition for your board or for your select board, this Place Economics firm is based in Washington, D.C., but they travel the country. Communities hire them to do economic impact studies for historic districts, kind of proving the things that I just discussed. Looking at, how does Main Street, Alabama contribute to the Alabama economy? How does, Wheeling, West Virginia's historic district compare to non-historic districts? And I think most of them are pretty consistent in that preservation makes a big financial impact in communities, but also it helps kind of stabilize. It doesn't necessarily make your neighborhood more expensive, but it helps stabilize and kind of take out the big swings maybe in the real estate market. And then Tom Mays from the National Trust has written a pretty great book called Why Old Places Matter. He spoke at our conference in Littleton 4 or so years ago, and he goes through some of the reasons that preservation might impact you or kind of pull on your heartstrings, whether it's for religious reasons, economic reasons, whatnot. So it's a good book. Check it out at your local library or purchase one. So what does preservation mean and what does it not mean? I think managing change is kind of the big takeaway here. You're not trying to restrict change or prevent change, but just manage it in a thoughtful way. We always advocate for keeping buildings in active use through, the term of rehabilitation, which means making changes to your building that don't restrict the character defining features, but make sure that they're able to be adapted to modern use. Because if buildings don't have champions and aren't appreciated, it's really hard to make an argument to save them, especially for future generations. And then just having a record of yesterday's craftsmanship, design. We want to leave a legacy on the landscapes that shows how our ancestors thought about construction, how they lived, etc. It does not mean kind of putting a bell jar over your historic district or your historic building. Again, buildings need to be adaptable and they need to be managed in a way that keeps them around for the next generation. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with people using historic districts or historic preservation as kind of weaponizing them to get to a certain end goal, maybe that's convenient for one neighbor, but not the next neighbor. So this kind of not in my backyard nonsense it's tough to sometimes avoid, but we try to encourage communities not to use historic districts and historic preservation as a means to an end, maybe to a wrong end. And then I know from traveling around the state, some historic district commissions and their ordinances are fairly outdated. Maybe they're from the 60s or 70s when they're, the time was different, right? So we were reacting to a lot of great change in the country. And so they're pretty strict, and maybe they were, the policies were based on some outdated thinking in terms of every building has to be white. So we try to encourage historic districts to avoid the aesthetic policing and focus more on kind of the big picture and the overall character of districts. And then similarly, promoting false senses of history is not encouraged. So, architecture evolves, and I think historic districts, if we stopped historic districts, or if we had historic districts 100 years ago, we wouldn't get some of the bungalows and the Victorians that make some of our areas special. So it's good to have, again, manage change, but do so in a way that allows history to continue building upon itself. So we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of these preservation commissions, which is kind of a bigger term for historic district commissions and heritage commissions. But today we're really focusing more on historic district commissions, kind of the regulatory side of these preservation commissions. Brandy's going to go more into the weeds, reading through all the RSAs and the fun language that gives us our framework. And then we'll talk about some examples and have plenty of time for questions and answers. But first, just a quick note on the differences between the two. So heritage commissions are town-wide. You have a town-wide charge, but you're non-regulatory. So the basis is really education, outreach. You're the conservation commission parallel in your town. They were designed to be mostly advocacy based, potentially hold easements on historic buildings, whereas historic district commissions have a narrower focus. You're going to have a boundary, you're going to have ordinances, and you're kind of approving or not approving changes to particular buildings. If you read the RSAs in New Hampshire law, it's actually at least the opening is pretty specific about why historic districts are created and why they're allowed as a public good. There are several court cases that back this up. And if you read through, so this is the opening of RSA 674-45, and it's talking about the reasons why we have historic districts and why they're permissible, even if your select board or some angry neighbors think that they are unlawful. So we talk about the values, like conserving property values, managing and steadying economic value, property values. Again, civic beauty and the education, pleasure, and welfare of citizens of the municipality. And this will come into play a little bit more. So historic district commissions, you're really in charge, again, of those particular neighborhoods that you're overseeing. But I want to actually get to the next slide because this is from Chris Skelly, who's presenting next. And I think it's a really smart way to see your role as a historic district commissioner. So the least amount of time you're spending should probably be on design review. And the next amount of time is designation. So reviewing your boundaries, seeing if they make sense. If there are additional buildings that should be evaluated, maybe expanded, or maybe some neighborhoods have changed and it's no longer kind of fair or makes sense to have them in the district. So survey. And then planning and outreach are going to be, ideally the most amount of time you spend. So we have a lot of historic districts that I'm sure feel like no one knows who they are, no one knows what they do. After maybe some time, there's some feelings of ill will. We certainly get communities that lose their historic district commissions, maybe over an unpopular decision. And I think a lot of that can be avoided if time spent on outreach and engagement and planning is part of your kind of everyday meeting. You want to make sure that you're hopefully having presentations maybe on preservation and researching your old house, doing programs that encourage proper painting or window restoration techniques, engaging with the community to constantly remind them why this place matters and why it's valuable, why they chose to live there, or why they choose to visit there, walk the sidewalks there. That's the important stuff. And then hopefully, the design review, when they come to you with their alteration changes, they know why it matters because they've spent most of their time understanding your role. And then just quickly, kind of a background. You're not alone. We have about 55 historic district commissions in New Hampshire and populations from 300 or so in Dorchester up to Manchester. at over 110,000 people in population. We have historic districts that span just a couple buildings and go all the way to entire neighborhoods and places like Somersworth that cover multiple neighborhoods. And maybe your historic district commission is combined with a heritage commission. We have dozens of communities that have both, and that might give you kind of a town-wide reach, but also a narrow focus. And you just maybe have to kind of keep both hats on and remember which commission you're representing at a certain time. Except for one community that I know of that somehow appointed their select board as the Historic District Commission. Your HDC is comprised of 3 to 7 members. And the reason that in New Hampshire, heritage commissions and HDC commissioners are appointed rather than elected is because every individual is supposed to have a certain level of qualification to be making the decisions they're making. So your board should be comprised of folks who appreciate architecture, construction, preservation, history, public history, and it's tougher in the small towns, I know, to find members. And I know, looking through websites, that there are vacancies and there are alternates that don't exist. And we can talk about some engagement strategies later towards the end. But hopefully your HDC is meeting with or has some overlay with the select board and the planning board, maybe the ZBA, so that there's some interplay between the different boards and everyone knows what each other is doing. Now I get to, I'm sorry, Brandy, you get to do all the RSA language and the real nitty gritty weedy stuff. So I'll let you take over now.
All right, here we go. I hope everybody has had that second cup of coffee that Noah mentioned. So thank you everybody for joining us today. We're really excited to be offering this track. Last year we thought was really great. We had great attendance and really good feedback. So we're really happy to be bringing it back. So I'm going to be covering, as Andrew said, some of the really meat and potatoes, legislation-based aspects of historic district ordinances and procedures. Just a note that in preparing the presentation, we assumed that we would have a mixed audience of attendees from communities with long-established historic districts, maybe some newly adopted ones, maybe communities who are thinking about in the exploration stage of potentially establishing one. So we tried to have a broad base of knowledge here in the presentation. And again, I just want to repeat that for anybody who is newer or might want to go back and look at things after, they are going to be available as recordings, which I think is great. Last year's are still up. I send them to people all the time. Please make sure you share with your fellow board members and anybody else who might be interested. So this is some information that Andrew has already covered, kind of, but this is the enabling legislation. As you all know, New Hampshire is an enabling legislation state, so the state has to authorize local legislative bodies to do things. And in this case, this is the RSA that gives local communities the authority to establish and create and regulate local historic districts. It is one of the most effective and comprehensive tools for managing change in your historic area. So I really want to emphasize that managing change part that Andrew brought up. Again, everything is about trying your best to ensure that changes will happen, it's inevitable, but that they're done thoughtfully and in a way that takes into account the character of your district. The other thing, which Chris is going to touch on in the next session, is ensuring that new construction and significant alterations are respectful of existing character. I know a lot of places sometimes forget, but new construction and infill is a really key component of the things that you're going to be reviewing in your historic district, especially in times like now where we have this housing crunch and, there could be a potential, boom on the horizon for getting some housing, new housing built and things like that. So keep in mind when you're looking at your regulations or your design guidelines that new construction or infill is always going to be a possibility regardless of how small your district is. And you want to know what you might want those things to look like when they happen. So before I get super into the weeds, here's a very oversimplified process of how you create a historic district and the Historic District Commission. The process for a Heritage Commission that serves as the Historic District Review Board is more or less the same. So I won't go into, specifically what that might involve. It's essentially more or less the same. So the first thing you want to do is define your goals and the purpose of your Heritage Historic District Commission. And then the council or the town vote to create the district, which generally is created as a zoning overlay. We have a few older historic districts in the state that somewhat function as their own zoning district, but a zoning overlay is really the most common way to do things, and it's really the cleanest way to do things. So that's usually the form that we say. And this vote will include recognizing the HDC or the Heritage Commission as the governing authority. When you have a historic district, this will also include the delineation of the review powers, and that means geographically, so the actual physical boundary of the district and otherwise. So what exactly is it that the HDC is going to be reviewing? What will trigger that review? Is it a building permit? Is it a demolition permit? Is it, various things? What will trigger that review, and what exactly will you be reviewing? Physical alterations, additions, etc. And then members and alternates are appointed by town council or selectmen. You will then request administrative support from the town. It's really important for all land use boards, and you have to remember that you are a land use board, just like your zoning and planning and conservation commission, so you deserve and should have administrative support in the same way. Members will then draft and adopt official rules of procedure, and we recommend no fewer than 4 meetings a year. I know some districts are going to be pretty small and they may not have that many applications, but like Andrew showed in some of his previous slides, a bulk of your work isn't necessarily reviewing requests for approval for changes. A bulk of your work is going to be education and outreach and that kind of thing. So it really is important that for the cohesion of your group and for your presence in the community that you do meet regularly. So in this section, I'm just going to cover briefly recommended elements of a historic district ordinance, recommended elements of your regulations and procedures, examples of design guidelines in the state, and recommended practices for applications and resulting certificates of approval. So historic district ordinances are meant to help preserve the character of a designated area. Again, you're going to hear it a few times, but it is really important to reiterate that the purpose is not to keep the district frozen in time, but instead to manage change in a way that ensures it is considerate of the historic nature and character of the district. So building on this, the ordinance must not be so restrictive that it deprives a property owner of all reasonable economic use of the property. That is more of a legal kind of leaning, a legal take on that. But it's also kind of a common sense take there that, you want to be respectful, but also, you don't want to be so restrictive that you can't really do much else. Just like all other land use regulations, it must honor a citizen's constitutional right to due process. So fair hearings must be provided, rational procedures must be followed. Um, and all land use regulations must comply with relevant state laws. Again, reiterating that local historic districts in New Hampshire generally take the form of the zoning overlay. Regulations and design guidelines are tailored to the community. So having your own your regulations and design guidelines that are developed in your community specifically for the nature and character of your historic district are very important. Design guidelines and regulations in a larger city like Portsmouth or Manchester, where you've got a lot of commercial buildings or industrial buildings, is going to be, they're going to be very different than a very small, more residential historic district, or maybe a small town with a town green and municipal buildings and other buildings around it. So the needs are going to be very different in each of those situations. So you really want to make sure that you're paying attention to what exactly it is that defines the character and the nature of your historic district, and how are you going to regulate those accordingly. So all preservation ordinances should have a statement of purpose that outlines the justification and goals of the ordinance. This example here is from Exeter, and you can see that it calls out the several goals, including property values, civic pride, general preservation values, and the education, pleasure, and welfare of the citizens of Exeter. So most of these, again, are going to be based on the language found in the RSA, and that's in order to ensure they are in compliance with that. A preservation ordinance should also have language establishing and designating the body that will have oversight in the historic district. Again, this can take the form of Historic District Commission, or the powers can be designated to a Heritage Commission. Some communities have separate HDCs and Heritage Commissions, and some communities have a Heritage Commission that also acts as the HDC. Both of those situations are in compliance with state regulations. Either situation is fine. Again, for the purpose of this presentation, I'll just be using Historic District Commission, or HDC, to mean whatever body it is that the review authority lies with. It's important that your ordinance call out the powers and duties of the governing board. Excuse me. This section of your ordinance is your opportunity to ensure strong language that supports your authority and role in local government. Never forget that local historic districts and the boards that review them have just as much right to existence and respect as the Conservation Commission, Zoning Board, Planning Board, and other boards and committees in your community. Again, you are on equal footing as a land use board, as with these other boards. Your charges are different, your powers and authority, duties are different, but your rights are the same. So at its core, a historic district is a collection of historic resources linked by a location or theme. When establishing a new historic district, it's useful to have a clear set of criteria for determining the makeup and boundaries of that district. This applies if you're going to be expanding or shrinking a district, if you have something existing as well. By creating a set of criteria and procedures for designating the district, you add another layer of credibility to the justification for that district. So by using standard preservation practices to determine a cohesive district, it really puts you in a good place for defense if you have to be in that place, which unfortunately does happen. So often these criteria for designation boil down to what exactly makes the district a cohesive district. And examples of things that may tie a group together include a group of buildings that all relate to a specific historic context. So for example, a town center that includes a collection of public use buildings like a church, a town hall, a fire station, a general store, maybe a town green in the middle. A group of buildings that were constructed for the same purpose or related purposes, such as a mill complex and or associated mill housing. Maybe a neighborhood that sprouted around a particular boom in growth. For example, post-war ranches and subdivisions from the late 40s and early 1950s. And yes, this is always a really hard point for folks to swallow, but they are historic now. All historic district ordinances should be as explicit and clear as possible about what kind of activities will trigger review by the HDC. This is very important and will ensure that your jurisdiction and authority are not left up to interpretation. This will also create transparency and predictability for property owners in the district, which goes a really long way in that outreach and kind of goodwill relationship with the community as well. Common activities that trigger review include any pulling of a building permit, construction of a new building or addition, changing of roof, siding, or windows, and signage. And again, I just want to reiterate that it's important to remember that reviewing new construction within the district is just as important as reviewing changes to the historic buildings. Part of what makes your district special is the overall character, and new construction can cause big changes to the character if not designed appropriately. And again, all of these slides, as well as the recording, will be available. So if I'm, if I'm going through a little quick for you to read everything and you want to take notes, you can go back and have access to those as well. Having clear standards for review in your ordinance will continue that path of transparency and predictability for property owners. It will also help inform the creation of design guidelines, which can take even more of the guessing out of the process. I will touch on design guidelines a little bit later in the presentation in more depth, but this example is from Amherst and includes reference to the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. The Secretary of the Interior Standards has 4 categories of standards that you usually see: preservation, restoration, reconstruction, and rehabilitation. The rehabilitation standards are the most widely used and referred to. They're the ones that our office use the most. They're the ones that in general programs like LCHIP and the Moose Plate program will use, grant programs. And they allow for flexibility and adaptation. Because remember, the goal of the HGC is to thoughtfully manage change, not prevent it. So these 6 criteria shown here, again from Amherst, are reflective of 6 of the 10 standards for rehabilitations and cover general guiding principles. This lays the foundations of expectations in the ordinance, and then these can be expanded upon and further illustrated in design guidelines that are adopted by the HGC after the ordinance is established. So again, in your ordinance, you want to lay out all of the basic framework, and then you can elaborate further on those to make things easier for you as a board to make your decisions and for property owners in the district to understand what their expectations are in things like design guidelines down the road. All ordinances should have language in them that points to or describes the proper legal appeal process. This includes zoning, planning, historic districts, and other local land use ordinances. In the case of historic districts, the prescribed appeals process per the state RSA is to the zoning board. In cases where there is no zoning board, there is another process described that involves a rehearing and ultimately an appeal in Superior Court. This is legally required to be in your ordinance, and it's the process that everyone will be following around the state. The enabling legislation also lays out ways to enforce and address violations of the requirements of the ordinance. This is often a difficult process and can sometimes be arduous to follow up or follow through with, depending on the resources available to your board or the town. The provisions are there, but we do often hear from communities who feel like they have to sometimes pick their battles. But it is important to remember that the state has enabled you to enforce your ordinance and address violations, and you do have the rights and authority to do so. So always keep that in mind. Again, you are a full-fledged land use board. So in addition to adopting an ordinance, which is what will establish the HGC, and lay out the basic framework, the HGC should also create and adopt regulations and rules of procedure. So ordinances contain the elements that we just discussed and are generally adopted into the overarching zoning ordinance in the same procedure that zoning changes are made in. So in town meeting for communities or a city council vote in communities with city governments. Both instances do require public hearings though. In contrast, regulations or procedures are adopted by a vote of the HGC itself. It does also require a public hearing, but these are the regulations that the board is agreeing to govern themselves by, and explicitly state the way that they intend to proceed with their review process and things like that. So they expand upon the details of the ordinance, but they can't expand the authority or the purview that's laid out in the ordinance. They just make it a little bit clearer about how that's going to happen. Some communities adopt separate rules of procedure that specify how meetings will be run, establish a code of ethics for board members, and outline other procedural items that the HGC will adhere to. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to call everything HGC regulations, regardless of the form that they take. They're called different things depending on the community. Either way, these documents create additional clarity and predictability for both the board and the property owners within the district. Again, I just want to emphasize that the more specific information you can have available for folks in the district, the easier it's going to be for them to understand what it is you're going to be asking for, and the easier it will be for you as a board to review and make your decisions, as well as justify and defend them if that happens to be the case at some point. So HGCs are also enabled by state law to participate in the building permit review process. State law lays out the timeline and process for the participation. You can see here I've got some language from the RSAs. This usually takes the form of requiring an application review and ultimately receiving a certificate of approval from the HGC. A building permit is usually one of the main triggers for HGC reviews, and that will be and should be in the HGC establishing ordinance. All HGC procedures should clearly lay out the process for review, as well as the requirements for what needs to be submitted as part of an application. This example here is from Claremont and shows some common requirements. Like a completed application form, a narrative description of the project, graphic materials of sufficient clarity and detail. This can refer to plans, elevations, perspectives, photos, etc., that are mentioned there at the bottom, or any other material that the applicant thinks may be helpful to the board. And you can see in the snapshot of the application form that they include a pretty detailed yet succinct list of requirements. So the application should be thorough enough to ensure that folks know what it is they need to include without being too overwhelming. You can always, in your application, tell folks to refer to your ordinance or procedures or your design guidelines for more specific detail. So this is from the town of Sandwich. It's a really great streamlined approach to summarizing their review procedures for people. It shows critical need-to-know information covered in an introduction and 6 short components. Again, this is really great for making things digestible and not quite as scary to property owners in the district, and much more understandable. So it shows the makeup of the board and requirement for a quorum, meeting days and times, as well as acknowledgement of their need to comply with open meeting and right to know laws, applications and fees, timeline and method of communication of commission findings. It's really important that folks have an idea of how long this process is going to take. It mentions the appeals process and that timeline, enforcement, and when applications are required. Some communities may have more detailed review procedures that include codes of ethics, references to how votes shall be made, meeting procedures, rules and terms for officers, and other items. But it can be helpful to include a brief summary of procedures similar to this within your larger HGC regulation document that can be used in your public engagement. So it is highly recommended that HGCs adopt design guidelines to help further clarify expectations within the district. Your ordinance will lay out a set of general principles that will be taken into account when reviewing work within the district. Design guidelines, however, can further detail exactly what the HGC is looking for when reviewing an application. This example is from Rye, and it shows a portion of their illustrated guidelines. You can see in the section addressing additions to existing buildings, they give several illustrations that show appropriate and inappropriate designs. And again, you can see the little drawings here for scale and massing. And again, in each case, they call out the qualities that make the designs appropriate, including scale, massing, location, design elements, and materials. For the sign guidance, they show several examples of types of appropriate signage and call out the qualities that make the signs appropriate, including lighting elements, materials, scale, and location. And then the exterior woodwork section, they not only give specific instructions for acceptable work, they also offer helpful guidance and routine maintenance for repair best practices. These more detailed design guidelines not only give property owners a very clear direction to go in when considering their project, but they also create the foundation of predictable and defensible decisions for the HGC. Again, in every instance that you can, you want to make things as understandable as possible for property owners and as predictable and defensible as possible for the board members. Okay, so now that we've gone over a lot of the fun legal and procedural stuff, let's talk about creating goodwill in your community through outreach and public engagement. So here, while we have a majority of the HGC's role is regulatory, there is also an inherent responsibility to foster a general appreciation for preservation in your community. So here I'm going to refer back to the little chart that Andrew showed, where kind of growing that knowledge base in your community and that relationship with folks in your district is really important. So things you might think about, if you haven't already: creating a page on your town's website, leveraging social media presence, introduce yourselves to other town officials and board and commission members, as well as town staff. Be willing and prepared to offer assistance or information about the HC's mission and goals. It's always great to have a little elevator speech prepared, just like a 2-minute, 1 minute. This is what we do and why it's important that we do it. Work closely with other boards and commissions in your town. You may come to see you share more goals in common than you think. It's always great to see if there are overlapping projects that you guys can work on. And reach out to community groups such as the Historical Society, Main Street Organization, business groups, and others. This slide is just a few project ideas for heritage commissions and HGCs that we've seen folks do around the state. Design exhibits or offer programs on local history, partner with schools, youth programs, senior programs, etc. Manage and start appropriate social media accounts. Recognize historic buildings or events with a plaque program. People love a plaque program, okay? If you're going to take notes today, take that down. Create a resource center for property owners in town. We know quite a few towns that have reading materials or handbooks or guidebooks available for people to come and check out either at the local library or even at the town offices about caring for your historic building, and know where to send them when you don't know the answers. So know, if you don't have the answers for them, maybe there's some guidance on the National Park Service website. They have a ton of guidance about caring for historic buildings. You can send them to us, and if we don't know the answer, again, we'll try to send them to the right place, send them to the Preservation Alliance. Andrew knows way more about what actually to do with physical buildings than I think he wants to know, but he's a great resource. Start a preservation awards program. Again, people love plaques, they love awards. Write articles and press releases for news media. Encourage your town to adopt preservation-friendly legislation like 79E and 79D. Those are both property tax-based regulations. Design and publicize a walking tour. I know quite a few communities have walking tours. Host workshops for owners of historic properties, things like how to research the history of your property, weatherization for historic buildings, how to identify architectural styles in the community, etc. And partner with other boards and commissions to create overlapping projects. So some best practices, just a quick overview again. Familiarize yourself with the RSAs and your HGC ordinances and regulations. Knowing what exactly the extent of your authority is, as well as your rights as a land use board, is very, very, very important. So familiarize yourself with those things. Review your ordinances and regulations regularly and consider boundary changes as needed. Historic districts are have the potential to be ever evolving as things are constantly getting older or changes are happening. So keep that in mind. Attend workshops and trainings like this. If you want more, ask. The Preservation Alliance and DHR, we're both two very small organizations or agencies, but we do our best to try to provide information and assistance when we can. And we also try to advertise any trainings that we might see offered by other organizations, including the National Alliance for Preservation Commissions, which has a very reasonable membership fee, and they offer online courses pretty regularly, webinars. So take a look at them. Build relationships with the district residents, town staff, other town boards, statewide contacts, and other nearby HDCs. Your neighboring towns and communities are probably facing very similar issues to what you're facing. A lot of folks are facing housing crunch issues. A lot of folks we're hearing about lately, they're grappling with how to review things like solar panels, things like that. So reach out to your neighbors, see what they've been doing, see what they've found success with, see what they've had struggles with. Sometimes there's no need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to how you're going to address certain treatments or designs, if the character of your districts are similar. Consider becoming a certified local government. If you're already one, you can seek funding for more survey work or design guidelines. Certified local governments the Certified Local Government Program is overseen by my office. I'm the coordinator for that. And it is a program that is run through the National Park Service, run by us. And we are allowed to give out small grants to certified local government communities. In order to qualify to be a certified local government community, you must have a regulatory historic district in place. So if anybody's out there with an HGC and they have questions about that program, my email will be in the next couple of slides, and you can take that down. Send me an email and I can send you more information. It's quite a process to get everything documented, and there are a few other requirements besides the HGC, but if you're interested, we can chat about it. And then host workshops or presentations to maintain and develop support for your HGC. Again, really being seen as proactive and helpful is one of the best things that you can do. Support for commissions. Oh, Andrew, I think you're going to jump back in here.
back in. This is the easy part. Brandy did all the tough stuff. Thanks, Brandy. No, but historic district commissions and heritage commissions, we hear it a lot, especially as I travel the state, that they feel kind of isolated and lonely, that there's no real formal network for them to tap when they have questions. But there are, the New Hampshire Municipal Association has been a good resource that we've recommended for folks. The BEA, the constantly rebranded and renamed state office for strategic thinking and planning and zoning. We talk, Brandy and I field questions often, and we're happy to, if anything, be a liaison to someone who might have the answer, or because we hear from all sorts of towns, we know that, the town next door is going through the exact same thing, so we can connect you to those folks. And then Brandy mentioned that the National Alliance for Preservation Commissions actually has very affordable and reasonable membership fees, and they offer lots of presentations. So they're not going to be able to probably provide the very weedy answers to New Hampshire's RSAs, but you'll be able to overall get a sense of, design guidelines and some of the bigger picture stuff with historic preservation and regulatory commissions. And
Andrew, I'm just going to jump in quickly. When Andrew and I say that NAPC has affordable membership, I just want to be clear that they're population based. And I think for most populations in New Hampshire, you're looking at $25 or $50, and that will cover your entire commission. Everybody in the commission gets access.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go to the next slide?
Yeah, I guess I can't do it. So here's our contact information. Yeah, I think there hopefully will be a lot of questions and answers, and I have some questions that have come my way that I can kind of act as, I guess, the moderator of that, if you want, Brandy.
Sure. Yeah. So the next slide we have here is just a slide for questions, but we can leave the contact slide up if folks would like that as well.
Great. So I did see a hand up from Susan Slack. We are going to try not to unmute folks. So if you have a question, just because there is a number of people, if you have a question, please put it in the chat for now. So we'll give folks, while we're giving folks a minute to put questions in the chat. I know, Brandy, you just did a lot of talking. So Andrew, do you want to start off maybe with a couple of questions that you've gotten your way?
Yeah, I mean, I think one we always get is budget. I think a lot of historic district commissions feel like they can't ask their towns for proper budget. And, we deal with a lot of commissions that have $100, $500, maybe a year. But I think a role of not a substantial budget, but at least a respectable budget is going to allow you to have funds to send your members to training or workshops or conferences. You're going to want to have some money set aside. Maybe if you have a particularly thorny issue, sometimes hiring a consultant or someone to come in and be that third neutral party that can share their expertise has been helpful for getting some projects unstuck. And then also for survey, other than the certified local government, it's hard to find money to do national register or state register survey work. So if your HDC has maybe a regular budget, a line item that allows you to survey properties, that helps clarify a lot of stuff, especially when you're, again, basing decisions off of structures. You need to know what is significant and what really should not be changed or could be changed, and survey helps answer those questions. All right, so Susan, oh, there we go. What type of information is included in a survey funded through a CLG grant?
So that's a really great question. When we use the term survey, often we mean any number of things. It's kind of an umbrella term that we use. With a CLG grant specifically, survey can cover anything from a town-wide survey, which is kind of like a really large contextual history of the town and the settlement patterns, and what we would call a windshield survey, which is just like basic photo information of the historic things in that community, down to a really, really detailed individual survey of a building or multiple buildings. And those usually take place on our state inventory forms, which also double as our state register forms. And so those include things like a written architectural description of the building, photographs that go along with that, a detailed history of the building, an evaluation of the historic significance of the building, and generally a recommendation as to whether or not that building or area, it can be an area as well, but is eligible for listing to, or meets the criteria of eligibility for listing to the National Register and or the State Register. So it can be kind of anywhere in between those two really big, there's a big gap there. And so that form can take whatever it might be that's going to be most useful to the community. In some communities, they want a very brief front and back single page information because they've got basics from the 80s and they just want it updated. In some communities, they want those very detailed individual forms. So it really can depend.
And I'll bring up a question I had emailed, and actually, Brandy, you and I talked about this yesterday, but for the benefit of the group, or actually, let's go to a Tuala's question first, because that's actually related to CLG. What is the CLG grant and who issues them?
So again, the Certified Local Government Program is overseen by our office. The National Park Service funds a majority of the work that we do at our office. We are majority federally funded, even as a state office. And as a requirement of receiving those funds, we have to pass through at least 10% to certified local government communities. So every year we get anywhere between $60,000 and $70,000 that we can pass through to certified local government communities. So as far as who issues them, it's our office. We have a grant round every year. We have only certain items qualify for those grants, like survey, etc. Thank you, Noah. It does not generally cover bricks and mortar grants. We always run out of money before we get to that tier of possibility of funding. But National Register nominations, workshops, trainings for your boards, survey and inventory. We've had some really interesting creative projects. The town of Amherst did a really great online mapping project, walking tours, things like that. So again, you have to be a certified local government. Right now, we have 29 certified local governments in New Hampshire. One of the biggest requirements to become a CLG is that you have to have a regulated historic district. If you do not have a regulated historic district, and it has to be a meaningful regulated historic district, which means it can't be town hall is the only building in your historic district and then the town doesn't have to follow the rules. It has to be an actual meaningful regulated historic district, among a few other qualifications. Then you can apply to become a certified local government. If you have questions about that, you can go to the website. I am working on an updated manual with information that is much more digestible. Unfortunately, the document there now is from sometime in the 90s. It's very long, it's very dry. Please email me if you have specific questions. We can set up a time to chat and we can go through all of that. Yeah, we have quite a few really interesting projects every year that our certified local government communities do, and we have a grant round every year for that. The process to become a certified local government, I'm going to be very clear about this because we get people that are interested, can take 6 months to a year, only because there is a lot of documentation you have to gather and send to me, and there are a lot of signatures that have to go back and forth like that. So it's not a quick solution, but it's a great option for folks who are really interested in doing some long-term projects, investing in the potential future capacity or capability of your board. And then I see this next question is, where are records for previous surveys retained, local or state? It really depends on who did the survey. So our office has, my guess would be a majority of surveys that have been done. And surveys are done for multiple reasons. Sometimes a community does them, sometimes we help pay for them through CLG. Sometimes a federal government agency pays for them as part of a federal undertaking. They're required to survey and evaluate buildings in an area that might be impacted by federal undertakings. So that includes things like highway projects, which is frankly where most of our survey comes from. New Hampshire DOT gets a lot of their funding from the Federal Highways Administration, so we have a lot of survey that they do, transmission lines projects, things like that. So we have most of our surveys. We have most of that at our office. It is available on our Emmett website, which unfortunately at this moment is subscription based. We're working on getting funding so we can make it free and available to everybody. If you have questions about what's available in your town, please email me and I'll send you to the right person who you can talk to about that. Some communities have copies of their surveys though as well.
So I'll ask this. The idea of use and if historic district commissions should control the uses within the buildings that they oversee. We have a few towns, like Brandy mentioned, where there are no zoning ordinances in a town, but there is a historic district commission. That HDC in the district kind of is a kind of de facto zoning island, and so technically use could be part of that HDC's oversight. But in an ideal world, yeah, your HDC is really only covering the exterior design elements of a building and not worrying so much about what's going on inside the building. And part of that you might read the room in your community, but generally, it shouldn't matter if you can get a 2-family house in a single family home, and if it doesn't impact the exterior, then that's a good project. If a conversion does impact the exterior and there needs to be changes and additions and doorways, then that's your purview. But otherwise, we advise groups to not worry so much about the use and leave that to the planning board.
I would agree. In theory, the things that you're regulating as far as scaling, design, materials, massing, even, location potentially on the lot, are all, should all already capture the requirements that you want the building to have. And then whatever happens inside, in theory, shouldn't really matter. There are exceptions. I don't want to throw a grenade in here, but there are exceptions to that. But in general, the regulations that you have should be hopefully doing their job without having to worry about what's going on inside.
And then I'll throw out this question that we kind of have a rehearsed answer to as well. We got this yesterday about kind of unique resources in a district and the extent of an HDC's role in regulating things like stone walls, trees, roads, forest land. We do have some HDCs that have interesting resources that they oversee. So it's going to be very community dependent. So yes, I mean, you could technically oversee things like road condition. If the dirt road, I'm thinking of Dorchester, their village, part of its significance is its narrow dirt roads around the common, and they feel like that is an important thing for them to regulate. We do have some that also look at trees and kind of having a oversight over, what trees come down and what types of trees could be planted. It's going to be up to your community and what kind of level of detail people are happy to accept, and what might push them over the edge and start maybe complaining or fomenting movements to dissolve your HDC. So read the room and be adaptable. I guess some of these things change too. You can always revise your ordinance based on feedback. All right. Susan Effingham says, public hearings aren't required for all applications for certificates of approval. There seems to be some discretion as to when to require a hearing. What criteria should be considered when determining a public hearing is required?
That's a great question. I think that that is something that should be addressed either in your ordinance or your rules of procedure so that it's very clear and again predictable for people, and that puts less liability on the board for looking like they're maybe picking and choosing or being arbitrary. So as far as what those criteria should be, that really depends. Sometimes it's the level of alteration or whether or not the application indicates things like, if it's just siding, for example, and the application says it's clabbered and we're putting clabber back, then you probably don't need a public hearing. And that criteria can be spelled out in your regulations or rules of procedures. My general advice would be if the application is thorough and indicates that things will be repaired as needed and or replaced in kind, then that may not rise to the level of a public hearing. Any other larger alteration may require a public hearing. And so for those would be new builds, additions, and significant changes that propose changes in materials, etc.
Okay, now the questions are flowing in. When an HDC application for approval is denied and appealed to the zoning board, is there a second part of this question? Maybe. That's actually. Yeah, there must be a second part. Etel, if you put that question in, but here's another one. How will the recent court decision on solar panels, I don't know if you're familiar, the recent New Hampshire Supreme Court decision, I'm blanking the name, I can get that, on solar panels up in the city of Franklin, impact HDC or other overlay district regulations?
I'm not familiar with the decision, so I don't know that I can speak to that, unfortunately. Andrew, have you heard about this scuttlebutt yet?
Yeah, I have to say I have not. So Christina, fill us in. I feel like I should know about this.
Yeah,
in the
same.
meantime, Paul's second point. So when an HDC application for approval is denied and appealed to the zoning board, is it appropriate for the board members or chair to attend and speak to the reason for denial?
I don't know. I really think that the denial from the HGC should have had a reason included with it, and a justification for that. And whenever you're going to do a denial, you should be as specific as you can about why it is being denied and point that back to your regulations or your ordinance or the RSAs so that it is supported by that. I don't know that anything precludes you from attending and speaking. But I would just be cautious that you don't want one person to get up there and speak for the whole board on the record, and maybe make a mistake. That's all, maybe a prepared statement or, something like that might be appropriate. But again, all of that reasoning should be in the denial and it should be defensible.
And I would say, all the instances I've heard where, some of these cases have gone to court or the ZBA, if they're ever overturned, it seems to be based on procedural problems, right? Like a decision was not made within 45 days or 30 days or whatever your ordinances might say. And so it's having those ordinances and sticking to your guns about them wins, if that makes sense. I mean, you're probably only going to lose a case if you're outside of your purview or if there's been a procedural error. Is that fair to say, Brandy? Is that your take on some recent decisions?
Yes.
All right. Okay, Julie in Exeter says, when an applicant comes in requesting new replacement for energy conservation, new replacement windows maybe, for energy conservation, they often say new windows don't need those ugly storms? What's a good response? Return on investment? I would say, I mean, preservation is all about kind of reversibility. And so, storms are reversible. And once you replace that original window unit with a new one, it's no longer reversible, right? You can't like remove that storm layer because the window's already been altered. So if you're following the Secretary of the Interior standards and those are part of your guidelines and your and I know Exeter actually has design guidelines, I think it's a fairly defensible response. That storm windows are accepted and encouraged. Replacement windows are not. That said, I have to say, the economic feasibility, there's a hardship clause in a lot of this, and we're finding storm windows and window restoration to be increasingly expensive. So it's boy, it's a tough one. I don't even know if we should get into that, but window replacement is tough, and I know a lot of HDCs have just kind of decided that it's not a battle that they're gonna fight, and they just provide some sort of guidelines for what the window should like, and whether that's the basic, boy, it's at least got to have simulated muntins or divided windows, or some are very detailed that said if you're going to replace them, we need to approve the replacements, and we need to have like fully extruded muntins. They need to be true divided, etc. I think you have to read the room on that and what your community has an appetite for.
Windows are tough. I mean, there
Yeah.
are studies out there that show that, appropriately rehabbed historic windows with storm windows are just as, if not more efficient than new windows. But it's a hard sell. I mean, it's tough. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the general number is like a window replacement will probably last around 20 years. The return on investment on a replacement window is about 60 years. So that alone, as you probably know, Julie, it's not good math, but it's really tough to get through those numbers to people who are constantly inundated with window ads all the time. Which is why sometimes workshops are great, right? If you can offer a window restoration workshop and you can offer sessions on window restoration.
And sometimes the best option too is to just try to push for the best replacement you can get. So if your district has a specific character and a lot of the buildings have similar window types, perhaps of a brand or manufacturer that makes a replacement window that is the most appropriate option. And, that's something that you can have cut sheets, little drawings available that show people how good the match is or something like that. You can't generally, prescribe things like that, but you can have it as a resource for people to look at.
I know Portland, Maine, in their historic districts, you have to provide, you have to show evidence that you've reached out to a window restoration and gotten a storm estimate along with your window replacement cost to show that you've done your homework and you've tried. And sometimes that exercise alone, some people don't know that you can actually restore windows. So that has encouraged some people, and maybe they've compromised and said, hey, the windows that are really kind of spectacular or have unique muntins or sash layout, those have to stay. You have to restore those. But if they're just 2/2 windows, and the window replacements are decent, we'll let that happen. So sometimes it's about finding common ground and compromise.
And that's where those resource libraries can be helpful too, right? Where you've got, maybe information about window restoration, maybe information about appropriate replacement windows, maybe information about, or like where to go, even a list of contractor, like that kind of thing. The Preservation Alliance has contractor lists and specialist lists on their website. You can point people there. So you're not doing it. You can avoid that, potential, look of conflict to point people there. So yeah, there's a bunch of different tactics to take. Unfortunately, I don't know that any of them are the best for everybody.
So I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Just for folks that weren't familiar with the Franklin decision, there are a couple of links in there. First to an New Hampshire Business Review article, and second, a summary of the case from New Hampshire Municipal Association. In short, the case was the city didn't have a solar ordinance. The applicant met all the site plan review regulations and was denied based on the board feeling that their application was not consistent with the purpose of site plan review regulations, despite having met all the regulations. The court basically said, you have to, the purpose statement of site plan review regulations do not have legal kind of weight for denying an application. Not sure if there's applicability here to historic, to HTCs, but that's kind of a summary of the case.
I guess I would say, just based on that very quick summary, my answer to Christina and everybody would be, the more detailed and explicit your regulations and design guides can be, again, the more defensible they will be in court.
Yeah.
Great. So we're just about at 10:15 on the dot. Julie has one more question, so I will, if either of you want to get that in, and then we'll have a 15-minute break and resume at 10:30.
You want to go, Andrew, or do you want?
When does a realtor have to disclose a building is in a historic district commission or historic district? We have a case in which a person did not know until closing. I don't
know that they're required to.
But part of it's going to be on the homeowner, right? But usually you like the zoning, the relevant zoning is in the packet of information, right? Am I wrong in that?
I don't know that that a layperson or property purchaser and or a realtor necessarily understands the nuances of some of the underlying land use requirements. Yeah. That's all. And I don't know what the disclosure requirements are. I don't know that they're required to do that, but I don't know. So I guess that's the answer. Sorry, Julie.
Yeah, we can find out a little bit more, Julie. And how should we enforce the certificate of approval? Call out a fee in the zoning ordinance or application?
Yeah, I think in the ordinance is the best place to put it, and then reiterate it on the application. Yeah. Yep. And then just very quickly, your last question there, Julie. The easements should be, that's a totally different thing than the zoning or HGC. The easement should be found in a title search, and that should be that's attached to the actual deed of the property, I assume. So that's a totally different animal. And that should be very clearly understood by the realtor and the property owner.
Yeah, 79D is tricky because
it's an easement. It's an easement that the property owner agreed to. It's tied to your property record. So.
Okay, well, this has been great. I think, folks, if you have additional questions, feel free to follow up with Brandy and Andrew directly. Brandy and Andrew, thank you so much. This has been very, very helpful. I know I learned a lot myself. We're going to have, like I said, about a 15-minute break now, a couple little less, so we'll resume in 12 minutes at 10:30. I see our next speaker is here. We'll hear a presentation from Christopher Skelly on infill development and design guidelines. Thank you so much.
Thank you.